it's a real joy to be with you on this somber day and to be sharing in this time of worship together. I know that we call this day Good Friday, but there's really very little that is good about it. It's a bad day. It's a horrible day. It's a day of great ugliness. And normally we do what we can to avoid ugliness. I mean, if we book a holiday, we tend to book a holiday to Banff, not to Moose Jaw. We tend to go somewhere where there are lush forests and not Arctic brush. We look for, maybe ask in the hotel reservation for the sea view, not the wall view. And at night, we probably go to the Thai restaurant, the one that has some sense of feng shui. It's going to serve the meal in a nice fashion, and we probably don't go across the street to Mary's Diner, where they've got the Friday fish special, served with canned peas and your choice of pudding for $10.95. And there's good reason that we don't. I mean, we make these choices. There's so much ugliness in life that when we take a vacation, we want to get away from it. All the ugliness that has washed over each one of us this week, hearing about Brussels and all of the savagery that has gone on, inhumaneness to one another, all of the refugees who now, if they cross the water, can only expect to be sent back across the water. They left nothing and will return to nothing. It's ugly. Sometimes we just want to escape the ugliness. Television's often a good way. You know how it is. You get home at the end of a day and you've got a backpack or briefcase. It's carrying all the weight of the world, and you just want to put it down. And a little later, get in front of the TV, just kick up your feet, just relax, escape all the ugliness. It's a good escape. A few weeks ago, the talent show The Voice was on NBC. Some of you may have seen it. It's a good escape. There's not much ugliness in The Voice. But that particular day, Nolan Neal was telling his story. He's 35 years old. He was saying how when he was 18, he had been given a contract, a music contract with Virgin Records. And his father called him up, and he said, "I've just been arrested by the police for selling drugs. I can't go back to jail. I've got a Beretta. I'm going to take care of it." And he said, Dad, I've just got this contract from Virgin Records. I'll take care of it. I can take care of it. And his father said dismissively, "You'll never be able to hang on to that." The words stung Nolan so much that he hung up the phone, and his father redialed 4 times. And each time, Nolan looked at his ringing phone and he pressed the ignore button 4 times. That was the last conversation he ever had with his father. It's ugliness. His mother said that after his father committed suicide, that he went into a swirl of alcoholism and a drug addiction for 11 years. All the ugliness of that, all the ugliness that we can inflict on one another. What a terrible thing to inflict on a son. The ugliness is in our families, too. A member of my own family, recently, she was brought up in the church. She recently said of Christianity that, that's the old way of doing things. The old way of doing things. It wouldn't hurt so much if it was just one person, but it's our children too. And it's not just our children, it's your children and other children, it's hundreds, it's thousands, it's millions of youth who are turned away from the church, not realizing, as an editorial in the Star says so beautifully today, that the Christian religion is about love. But somehow people are misconstruing it into narrow-minded bigotry and self-righteousness. It's a good thing that Jesus does not turn away from all the ugliness. It's a good thing that God does not turn away from the ugliness. God could look at us in our situation and could say, well, you've made a fine mess of it. You're the ones who've done this. I'm out of here. You fix it. It's your mess. But God doesn't. God says, I embrace you. You know, if the Antiques Roadshow were to come to Appleby Arena and we were to take there to the Antiques Roadshow all these big fancy crosses that we have in our churches, we wouldn't even get to the door, and the appraisers would be out there to meet us and tell us that they're all fake, that they aren't real, that these are fancy crosses. This has almost no resemblance to the cross in many ways, because the original cross was ugly. It was ugly. I mean, we imagine that it's, 6 by 6 from Rona. We imagine that it's all smooth and plain. But in fact, it's just tree trunks. The branches have been hacked off with a primitive axe. The bark is still on it. And we imagine that it's all fresh and new wood, and it isn't. The historian Josephus tells us that the closest fresh timber to Jerusalem, because they had chopped it all down, the closest fresh timber to Jerusalem at Jesus' time was 20 kilometers outside of the city. Do you think that they're going to get a fresh cross for every criminal? No, Jesus' cross had been used before. It is stained with blood. It smells. And it is scored with holes from nails. It's ugly. It's just that kind of ugliness that we want to run from. I imagine the Roman soldiers who had to do the crucifixion. They chose the youngest one, the newest recruit, to do the worst of the job. It would have been the youngest person, probably a teenager, no more than 12 or 13, who was instructed to pound the nails in. It's one thing to pound a nail into wood, it's another thing to pound a nail into flesh and bone. And to hear the screams and to see the blood, it's ugly. And that young recruit would have had to try and control his retching and try not to vomit because he was so repulsed by it all. The Bible has no references to PTSD. But it's got a lot of references to people who have demons. We want to flee from the scene. We don't even want to think about it. And yet, Jesus embraced it all. There was no reverence shown to Jesus when he was crucified. There weren't people standing around with their hats off. There was a knot of his followers and family who were in deep grief and wailing, but you probably wouldn't have even heard their wails because of the laughter. It was entertainment for those people. Many of them were day laborers who had been in the marketplace that morning and hoped to get one of the jobs allotted and hadn't been given it, and so they were gathered where there were people gathered. To see someone crucified was a kind of sport. It was mockery. They put a crown of thorns on Jesus' head. They had this sign in 3 languages, King of the Jews. It was mockery. And there were kids who had skipped school, and they were there too, although their parents had forbidden them. The prophet Isaiah speaks about Jesus on the cross, but he doesn't have all the details. When someone is crucified, they do not die from the nails. They die from asphyxiation. The arms are tied to the crossbars, and then the weight of the body is held by the arms and these muscles. And both the chest muscles and the diaphragm muscles are what we need to breathe. And those muscles are fully stretched when you're on the cross, so when you breathe, you have to stretch them further to get breath. And eventually those muscles get so exhausted that they cannot move. And even though you're gasping for breath, you cannot have breath. And Jesus, even in his diminished breath, still was choosing to care for his family, still was choosing to care for Mary. He looks from the cross and says, Mary, here is your son, John, the beloved disciple. Mary, here is your son. John, here is your mother. The prophet Isaiah, what the prophet Isaiah does say, he says, prophetically, nothing in his appearance, there was nothing in the suffering servant's appearance that we should desire him. And scholars have said, well, that's prophecy. Isaiah is writing about the suffering servant. Jesus is the suffering servant. And there being nothing in his appearance that we would desire him, that refers, some scholars say, to the fact that Jesus was not comely. Jesus was unattractive. Jesus was ugly. We don't know what Jesus looked like. But I somehow doubt that the prophet Isaiah, in a prophetic stance, would ever say that Jesus or anyone was ugly. Because in God's sight, every human being is beautiful. Every human being is beautiful. God loves every human being. So God would not single out some as ugly and some as not. I think that these words of Isaiah might well be words that are less descriptive of how Jesus looked throughout his life than they are an accurate picture of what we see this morning. This is the full context of what Isaiah says. The suffering servant, Jesus, had no form or majesty that we should look at him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity, and we held him of no account. Look, there on the cross. Behold, your God. Who can stand all the ugliness? It's all around us, and it's in us. Recently at church, some people were standing around at coffee, and one person asked, "Are you going to the Good Friday service?" And one of the young fathers who had a child hanging from his sleeve said, "Yes, I'm going to be there. I'm going to be dressed as a Roman soldier." And a woman responded, and she said, "Well, I'm not going to be there. I don't do Good Friday. It's too much of a downer. I'll go at Easter. And we you know, where was she speaking from? Because it might well be that she has so much ugliness in her life that she can't contemplate. Maybe she's a nurse on a ward in the hospital where it's difficult to see the kinds of things she sees each day. Or maybe she's a CEO who's having to do cutbacks. But it's easy to understand why someone would take the express bus to Easter and not take the local bus that stops at Good Friday. Some of you were in church on Palm Sunday, and then you were probably waving your palm branches, and you might even have seen Jesus exit the church as part of the parade on his way to his death. But you may not have seen later on in that day when on TV he finally arrived at his destination in Jerusalem. The TV showed it beautifully. The crowds were there on both sides of the street, and many of the crowds were looking at themselves on a big jumbotron screen on the ancient walls of Jerusalem, the big stone wall, big jumbotron, and you could see some of them waving because the cameras were on them. And you could hear the announcers, the TV announcers were giving their speech about who Jesus was, how he was a great healer and a great teacher, wonderful teacher. They said that he even had royal blood. And the cameras would keep shifting. They'd look first of all over to the announcers, and then they would look far down the road to the east, where the road kind of went down over a hill and they couldn't see any further, but out in the direction of Bethany from which Jesus was going to come. And they're all waiting for him to come. The camera shifts over to a police motorcycle that's patrolling the route, and then back to the crowds where children are playing or a girl is sitting on her father's shoulders. The only other movement on that road was a lime green Municipality of Jerusalem garbage truck. I mean, it was completely inconsistent with the picture. It's as though the dispatcher had not checked the parade permits that day, and so the guy was just doing his regular haul. So here's this garbage truck coming up the road, and it's off in the distance, and the driver gets out of the cab and goes over to one curb, and the people hand big green garbage bags, and he takes them and puts them in the truck and goes to the other curb and gets the garbage bags from there, climbs back up in the cab. And the whole truck lurches forward the way those garbage trucks do, and then went a short distance and stopped. And the same thing happened again. And it was, as it got closer, you could even hear the shriek of its air brakes every time it stopped. And then as the announcers were looking, they noticed that the people were waving their palm branches. And they were surging forward. And they were surging forward around the garbage truck. And they were saying, "It's him, it's him." And finally the telescopic lens of the camera zeroes in on the face of the driver, and it's Jesus. The one who's got that orange vest on, with the yellow cross on the back. It's Jesus. Maybe some of you saw it. Did you see what happened next? He drove that garbage truck. It was near the end of his run. He drove that garbage truck up to a hill just outside of Jerusalem. I don't know how long. And he dumped all of the garbage there. I don't know how long he had been doing that route. I mean, maybe he had been doing it all of his life. But we do know that he was already doing that garbage route when John the Baptist saw him in the beginning of this gospel, the Gospel of John. Remember, John was out in the wilderness and saw Jesus, and he pointed with his long, skinny, bony finger, "Look, the Lamb of God." who takes away the sin of the world. Already he was doing that. Jesus had gone to the four corners of the earth, gone to every home and hovel and hotel and collected all the garbage, your garbage and my garbage, and had piled it there on the hill outside of Jerusalem. In fact, it was such a big hill. Some people said that it was so high that it was probably as high as Mount Everest, but they were probably exaggerating. We know, though, that it probably stank to high heaven. And Jesus took all that ugliness of the world upon himself. And he washed himself in our stench. And when finally he was raised on the cross, that cross was raised on the top of that garbage heap. And his body was draped on that cross like a flag, like the Canadian flag at the North Pole, claiming all of that territory, all of that ugliness for God. This is mine, God says. This is mine. And then he said beautiful words. Jesus said beautiful words from the cross. He said to those who are imprisoned, whether in jail or in a hospital room or in mental illness, he said, I free you. To those families who have borne the burden of suicide, he says, let me carry your burden. To children who are bullied in the playground, he says, I am with you. Peace be upon you. Such remarkably beautiful words that he should say them to us. They're so beautiful that they almost transform the ugliness into something beautiful. They change the badness of this day. Well, it almost makes you want to say that today is Good Friday. May it be so for you. And may we all live up to Christ's example. Amen.